Hello. Hi. My name is Prathamesh Sonpatki. I work at Last9 building a world-class operational intelligence platform for SREs. The Last9 platform helps people find root cause of failures, increase efficiency, and prevent failures with ease. Today, I'm going to talk about how we improved reliability of our front-end code base and made it more manageable. This talk does not have any specific internals about React. Like you will not get like go and change this piece of code in your app. I'll not be talking about such internals, but I'll be talking about some practical tips that work for us in a fast-paced startup environment. The ideas are not revolutionary. In fact, you will find that these ideas are very simple in theory if we talk about it, but while applying them in practical use cases, they do the magic very well and make the code base reliable and manageable. So let's start. Every project starts with a blank slate. As we are building something out of thin air, we don't have any background. We just have few hypotheses to build upon. And we also started similarly. We started with a simple create React app on day zero. Initially, every for every startup, the first few months are always about building and learning from customers, building and learning from our hypothesis, and getting things together. So we are always in the build mode where we are building, shipping features, and we are in the ideation phase where we test our hypothesis with real world. We ship our features and then get some feedback. Based on that, we change few things, we fix few things. So for first few months, we are always in this build mode where we are always shipping something. But what happens is that if you don't pay attention to the code base, slowly it sort of begins to rot. And what happens is that if we don't pay the closer attention to some of the features that we are shipping, then adding new features or fixing bugs becomes difficult over the time. Nobody basically remembers why that line 338 exists in my index.js file, or why that particular graph.tsx file has become so big that it has now more than 1,000 lines. Nobody knows that. Fixing one bug might result into creating some other bugs. We always get some random surprises on the fly. Team gets frustrated. Nobody wants to basically touch that particular piece of code. It adds mental overhead and blah blah blah. Basically, nobody wants to touch that code at all. And this is where the reality sinks in. Like after a few months, the good phase has gone, and now we are in a phase where we have to ship features, but also at the same time we have to make sure that the code base is in a state where adding new features or fixing bugs is easier and is possible. So rewriting everything, not always an option, and it was definitely not an option for that was available to us, as our customers were already using the app and we didn't have bandwidth to start from scratch again. So we had to work with the existing code base and use practices and tools and set up processes that helped us in making this code a bit manageable than what we had earlier. So what do we do, right? Of course, our first step of fixing any mess is accepting, yes, there is a mess, right? Because only after doing that, we can sort of start looking into it objectively and start fixing it. So let's talk about what do we mean by bad code? And here I'm not talking about like theoretical concepts, but what it meant in terms of our application. So bad code for us was it was very hard to extend that code. Enhancing any existing feature, like let's say we have a sidebar and we want to create another sidebar where there were some different entities. So extending that feature meant we broke something else in the existing sidebar. Uh, to avoid this breakage, you sort of start adding code which results in duplication. So for example, if you have one function, because we are not able to extend it, you sort of use some of its functionality and duplicate it at some other place. But this resulted into code duplication. And then it results into bugs because when you try to change some of the logic in both of these functions, you forget to do it at one place, but do it at few other places. So then it results into random bugs, results into lack of consistency and structure. which makes it harder to understand over time why this particular function is present in this file, and then why a similar function is also present in some other file, but they're sort of doing same thing but not doing same thing, one line difference and so on. So the code base overall becomes very hard to understand. So basically it lacked the consistency and structure, and that's where started resulting into unrelated pieces getting broken after deploying to production, things not getting caught early during code reviews because there were multiple places where the similar logic was present and so on, resulted into a lot of cascading failures. So that sort of got us into the picture that no, we have to uh, like take a step back and basically start thinking about how to fix that. So it was basically going back to the drawing board again and fix it. But by fixing, what do I mean by fixing, right? So yes, we have accepted that we have code which is not in a good shape, and we have identified a few areas that are causing us problems like consistency, structure, duplication, and so on. But fixing it from this to the good code part, what do we mean by that? Like, what exactly do we mean by good code? So good code from a reliability and management point of view, there are three things that we look for in a good code base. First is obviously you should have confidence in that code. Then you should have safety, right? Like the reliability comes from having a safety net that you have in your processes that prevents you from doing the same mistakes again and again. And the most important part that sometimes we miss out is having a shared mental model where other team members or people not from the programmer teams also understand how this particular code base works, or what are the limitations, what are the specific things that this particular code base does. So these are the three things that we will be focusing on in this talk, and discuss how we improved on these 3 points. So let's talk about confidence first. Confidence is all about being certain about a piece of code doing one thing and doing it well. Obviously, it also means that not doing anything else, because a lot of times what happens is that when we start writing code, we try to extend a piece of code for other features, and then it sort of breaks down the existing functionality as well as it doesn't work with the new functionality. So doing one thing and doing it well is very important. And in terms of code base, it boils down to writing smaller functions. So here we have a sample function which basically given a timestamp, it validates it. I have, just for the sake of simplicity, I have added only one condition, but in reality, there are some other clauses that are there which check whether this particular timestamp is valid or not. So this is how we start. This is the starting point for our function. But slowly what happens is that if the timestamp is valid, we want to dispatch some action in our store, because based on that we'll take some action, we'll show something to user or something like that. And then slowly we realize that no, but we cannot dispatch it directly. We have to only dispatch if this particular user is admin. So now we have added a conditional block here, right? So this is another mental headache that happens in this function. And somebody doing a code review or code check, if I check the name of the function as validate timestamp, I don't understand what exactly other things that is it doing. So here we are doing a side effect, right? In while checking the validation of the timestamp, we are also dispatching the action under certain conditions. So instead of this, if you just split it into two parts, by writing pure functions, right? So we try to have a pure function which basically takes an input, produces an output. That's it. It doesn't have any side effect. And that way it becomes very easier to understand the code base, as well as very easy to reuse the code base, because we can reuse the same pure function at other places as well. But the most important thing that it gives us is that they're pure JavaScript functions. There is no concept of having some framework related code, or having some library related code in these pure functions. They basically take an input and give the output back. So we can basically pull out these functions, put it into helper classes or helper methods, and then basically try to and try to use them and reuse them. They don't have anything about using anything about React, Redux, or any particular library, and that allows us to also test them, because we can simply write unit tests for the given input, expect the output, and that helps us increasing having the confidence in our code. Because writing testable code is as important as writing code, right? We cannot write code which we cannot really test, and writing the pure function sort of help us in the first step, where we are able to write the unit tests very in a very seamless manner for our pure functions. So when we started this exercise, we realized that a lot of our React components were using these kind of functions, but they were also relying on the global state of the component, or they were also doing sort of some side effects to the other parts of the application. And pulling those functions out and putting those into separate files helped us in sort of removing that ambiguity, that our functions, even if they're using a state attribute, we always made sure that we pass that attribute as an input, because only then we are able to pull those functions out and test them separately, independent of the React component itself. So that allowed us to sort of increase the unit test coverage in our application. When that reality check happened, we had very less test coverage, but after applying this practice, our test coverage got increased to around 25 to 30%, and that helped us while fixing the bugs, because every bug fix was coupled with a test, regression test, and a pure function as much as possible. 100% test coverage is obviously a myth. I would not say that we should strive for it actively, but adding these kind of pure functions and coupling it with a unit test allowed us to have more confidence in our code. Obviously, unit tests are not the 100% solution, because a lot of times what happens is that having a unit test doesn't mean that you're tested the flow end to end. So in our case, we also use Cypress for writing end to end tests, and those tests helped us basically document and test complicated user workflows, like what happens after the user clicks on a particular entry in the UI, or what happens after user deletes something or clicks something. So those kind of workflows we were able to test using Cypress. Initially, we were a bit skeptical about Cypress, because the integration tests, they tend to be slow, and sometimes they also tend to be flaky. But over last 6 months, what we realized that those Cypress tests actually helped us and saved us, because when we were refactoring a lot of code, uh, these tests actually helped us in catching bugs. So in a hindsight, the decision of relying on end-to-end tests turned out to be pretty well, though at the time when we started it, we were a bit skeptical about them. So we have integrated Cypress tests in our CI, GitHub Action CI, and we run them frequently. So that also helped us in increasing the confidence in our code. A test is always a important aspect of having confidence, but another important aspect of increasing confidence in our code is using the API that the framework gives us in an efficient manner. So in case of our application, it was about using the hooks API confidently, because we ran into few issues when we started the app. We ran into some usability issues, we ran into some overuse of hooks, and we wanted to address those while converting this code from a bad shape to good shape. So regarding hooks, they were introduced in React 16.8, and that allows us using state and React features like other React features without writing the component classes. So before this, there was a component class API in React, but Hook sort of allowed using the same functionality in a functional manner. So there are use effect and use state. These are the hooks that are very popular and widely used. But we also realized that we needed two more hooks for performance reasons, and as well as making sure that the state updates are transferred to our children component seamlessly. The first hook that I will talk about is when we don't want to use the use effect hook. So sometimes what happens is that when we are populating the state from the URL, then we don't want to run certain use effects on their first load when the component gets mounted for the first time. But we only want to invoke them when user takes some action after the page is loaded. So in those cases, we don't want to use the use effect on first mount. And this is a modified version of use effect, which basically checks whether the component is getting mounted for the first time, and if it does, then it skips the callback, and instead of that, it will just do nothing. So we will not run the use effect hook on the first load, but when you run it on any other user interaction after the page is loaded, we want to run it on any subsequent changes. So this hook sort of helped us in streamlining our state management, because we were able to make sure that certain hooks in certain interactions don't run on first load. Another important hook that we used was use callback. Before talking about it, let's see how basically equality works in JavaScript. So when we are comparing the primitive objects, like let's say Boolean or numbers or character strings, then we can see that the same object returns true if we compare them. But if we compare hash literals or arrays or functions, we basically get false, because every occurrence of that particular object creates a new object, because JavaScript doesn't follow the referential equality. So what happens is that in case of effects where we are using objects as arrays and maps in our components, then during re-renders, even if their content doesn't change, because the object gets created again, the components get re-rendered unnecessarily. So for example, if I have a array object for selected items, and I pass that selected items in a function to my list component, then during re-render, even if my list items are not going to get changed, but because that object gets recreated again, my component gets re-rendered unnecessarily. And in these cases, just wrapping that particular function within a use callback hook helps, because then use callback takes care of doing the internal comparison on the selected items, and only if the contents change, only then our component will get re-rendered. So this is an example of using use callback for a function. It's a good hook when we have these kind of objects which doesn't match the referential equality. um, so it helps us in avoiding unnecessary re-rendering. There is one more hook called as use memo, which is a sibling of use callback. So where use callback is important for wrapping functions, use memo is important for or useful for wrapping values. So whenever we have some values which are in the shape of arrays or maps, then we can use memo to make sure that it doesn't frequently change. It helps us in improving performance, as well as making sure that unnecessary re-renders doesn't happen. So that's how we use this hook for maintaining the sanity in the code base. There is one more thing that I want to talk about, which help us a lot, and it is that exhaustive depths ESLint rule. This rule comes from the React API itself, and most importantly, even if it causes a lot of warnings in our code base, you should never disable it. Even Dan Abramov from React team says that you should not ignore these warnings, because what these warnings tell us is that you are missing something in your use effect on which you depend on. So we should not take like we should not ignore these warnings. For example, if I have a use effect which is depending on views length, but inside this function, I can also see that I'm accessing graph type, and graph type is also another state attribute in my component. And here I'm missing that. So in this array, I only have views.length. So basically what I'm saying is my use effect depends only on one of the attribute, but I'm using another attribute also inside the use effect. So this ESLint rule basically gives us a warning in such cases and tells us that no, you have to add the graph type also inside the use effect, so that we are protected from the side effects or random surprises that happen due to state being stale, or the graph type not having the correct value if it changes at some other part of the application. we should not use the stale value inside this user. So this ESLint rule is extremely important, and ignoring it is not recommended. As such, ignoring any warning is bad, according to me. And I'll talk about how we treat the warnings also in next part of my talk. So with these things, having pure functions, having a command on hooks API, and using some custom hooks, we were pretty confident about the interactions in our code base, and slowly our code base was getting into shape. But we also wanted to make sure that while these steps of having this confidence definitely helped us, we also wanted to be diligent about not running into the broken window syndrome again. So we wanted a kind of a safety toolkit similar to the medical box that we have at home, which can keep us on our course, and when basically we are tempted to deviate from it. So we wanted to have such safety toolkit with us. And the most important ingredient of that safety toolkit was TypeScript. TypeScript was a lifesaver for us. Basically, if you have never heard of TypeScript, it is a superset of JavaScript, which allows adding optional typing to our JavaScript code. It is a superset, so our existing code continues to work, and the typing is optional, so you can have certain part of the application with types, and the rest of the application as it is. So you can basically gradually start adding types to your code. But overall, it improves the reliability of code base by a huge margin. And to tell you a sample example, here is how you can basically define a type. So here I'm defining a timestamp object and defining its type as number. But then I can also extend it and convert it into a maybe timestamp. So while my data is getting loaded, initially the timestamp may be null or undefined. So I am using the existing timestamp and composing a new type out of it. I can also define user interfaces, like for time range, I can use the timestamp type that I created earlier for the from and to values. And even I can create enums. So I like this enums because I can basically map it to my API contract. And then I don't have to worry about having deviated from that API contract. So following the API contract strictly becomes quite possible using these kind of custom types that we can make out of the existing types. And then we can use them in functions with the colon syntax. We can also write types for the return value of a function. This is extremely important in case of refactoring, because when we are refactoring a function, while we have different callers calling that function, uh, the code doesn't compile until you fix all occurrences or until you change all occurrences of that function. So having these return types and the types for the arguments helps us a lot. Important and funny thing here is that before running into this situation, we were already using TypeScript, but most of the times we were using the any type, which basically means that this type can mean anything, and it was not helping us, because the use of TypeScript was only notional use. We were not using it diligently. But after this realization that we need to fix the code base, we started using it extremely diligently, and then it helped us in um, improving the health of the code base. We can also extend the type interfaces that we have created. So for example, here I have created an interface for query object, but then if I want to use it with limit in certain API calls, I can just extend it and use it. So it is similar to writing code. You're not writing any other thing. You're just writing code as types, and it will just apply those types at compile time. It helped us in code reusability. Code refactoring became a lot easier because code doesn't compile until basically all occurrences of that validate function time are changed, or all calls of that validate timestamp are changed. If I'm adding a new argument, the code doesn't compile. So that helped us in catching bugs at the development type itself. There were no random surprises out of the blue at runtime. The undefined, not found errors sort of reduced. And in fact, net result, if I talk about the outcome after doing this exercise for a few months, was that our sentry errors reduced by over 80%, and that was a huge win. because earlier we used to have a lot of errors where the API contract was not followed properly, or the certain times you are passing wrong values to the functions. All of those things just went away. Readability and predictability also improved. The only gripe that I have about is that the overall compilation time sort of increased a lot, because TypeScript was taking some time to go over the code base and compile it. But other than that, it was a huge win in terms of just in improving the reliability and making sure that the code base doesn't deteriorate again. So converting the JavaScript code into TypeScript code is possible on a gradual basis, and a lot of editors also support the integrations out of the box. So I'll highly recommend checking out TypeScript if you're not using it already. The other two friends that we had were ESLint and Prettier. And as I mentioned earlier, their warnings should not be ignored at all. So similar to the exhaustive depths rule that we discussed earlier, there are various other rules which make our lives as a developer easier and give us warning before we deploy a build. Sometimes we tend to treat those warnings as, what is this warning? I don't want to see this warning, let's ignore that. But what we did was we added this max warning 0 in our ESLint command. And basically what this mean to us that our build, CI build, used to throw errors if there was even one warning that is thrown by ESLint. And that helped us in mitigating a lot of warnings that we were ignoring earlier. Because the build fails, you have to fix it, and then only then the build will pass. So it helps us proactively fix the warnings upfront and keep the code quality in check. So in certain cases, the decision of ignoring warnings was taken on purpose after seeing the use cases and after making sure that, okay, we can ignore these warnings inline. But otherwise, having this max warning 0 in the build sort of protected us from ignoring warnings which get ignored due to manual oversight. Because a lot of times in development, when we are shipping at a fast pace, we tend to ignore these things, but we should not. And that also helped us a lot in maintaining the code quality. So having talked about the code a lot and improving the confidence safety in the code base, I also want to talk about the other part where working in teams is not just about the code, right? We have designers, we have our higher management in our team, which will not have necessarily the time to check the code base all the time. Only the developer knows the internal details about a particular code base. So restoring the confidence and having a safety toolkit helps us as developers. Having a shared vocabulary helps everyone else in the team also. And that's where the mental model comes into the picture. So mental model is termed as having a knowledge structure held by each member of the team that enables them to form accurate explanations and expectations from a particular piece of code is my added definition, but this is how a mental model works. And having a common ground on what we are building and how it is getting built is of utmost importance, because we have a distributed team where a platform team and product team works in different sprints, in different terminologies, and having a explanation about how the API that is developed by a backend developer is going to get used by the front-end application is extremely important. The backend developer not necessarily will check the code that the front-end team is shipping every day to understand how they're using it. So if we provide them with some documentation diagram, they will be able to understand these things easily, and they will have a mental model about how their feature is going to get used by other teams. So we rely on things like sequence diagram. These are almost first class citizens for every new feature that we are working on. We write flow charts. We try to prepare these diagrams and share them upfront so that these basically document our coding process, and we not necessarily have to check code all the time to understand how a feature is working. We also rely a lot on comments. A lot of times we sort of discourage writing comments in programming because our mantra is that comments get outdated very quickly. But what we have realized is that writing comments for business related decisions in the code is important. And because we don't remember that decision after a month, like why this particular if condition was added, it was added because there was something missing in the backend API, and we had to accommodate that change in front end for time being. And those kind of decisions get lost in Slack or in emails or in any other tool that we use. But having certain comments in the code base actually helps us in having that background on that feature, like why this was done in this way. So yes, don't write comments for everything, but especially for business decisions that are important and that you will tend to forget, having comments helps extremely. So now, after doing these three things, having restoring the confidence, having a safety toolkit to basically save us from the temptations of doing things in a different way in future, and having a shared vocabulary that we can share with our team members, in a better way. We have sort of converted or moved away from our bad code, and we can say that the code is in a decent shape now. This Following these three practices to the T helped us improved our code base. We sort of rescued it from the from the bad shape and made it more reliable. Adding new features or changes doesn't feel like a burden, and we sort of look at it from a positive angle that yes, we are able to ship things at a better pace, and even if the bugs happen, we are able to fix those and in a consistent and reliable manner. They don't affect the whole world unnecessarily. So then we become happy again, right? Having followed these practices for over last 5 to 6 months, I can say that they help us in a fast-paced environment where we were able to ship things very quickly. And even if these things are not like the framework specific things, these are general programming guidelines, and our team was also not very experience in React, right? But just following these general programming guidelines of pure functions, maintaining the code in a way that it is testable, and making sure that we are using the API correctly. These things help us in improving the code base. If sort of things resonates with you, then do let me know in comments and questions. And you can also reach out to me on Twitter or via email. I'll definitely try to answer some of your questions. Thank you. Thank you.